And welcome to everybody to the first session of this year of the Water School Africa Online. And for this session, it really gives me great pleasure to introduce Paul Quinn, who we've been working with for the last almost over a decade in the UK. Though, of course, Paul has been working for many decades in this sphere. Paul's a scientist. I'll leave you. He's been teaching in Newcastle University. He's studied hydrology, geology, various other disciplines that actually understand how water moves in the landscape. And over and above that, he's the pioneer behind a lot of holding water in the landscape with communities in the UK, so that communities can do that work themselves and alleviate their problems of flooding. Now, Paul also works in Scotland, and he's worked all over the world, and he is going to today share with us some of those experiences of community-based work of holding water in the landscape that he's been doing across the UK and hopefully maybe the world. And also, Paul will take us through some of the terms that are used for this kind of work and what they really actually mean. So great pleasure, Paul. Welcome to the session, and over to you.
Okay. Right. Part one. Okay, thanks everybody. And it's can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you, and it's been a long time working with Philip and Minnie, and Minnie phoned us up and saying, "Oh, you're building leaky dams on farms." I said, "Oh yeah, yeah." She said, "Oh, we're building leaky dams on farms as well." She said, "How many have you done?" I said, "Oh, very proud. I've done about 50." And Minnie said, "Oh, we've done 15,000." So we definitely needed to work together. And this floods and droughts issue is really the issue, because when I talk about water, or when we talk about water, it's always talking about the water balance, what happens in a whole year. And so your seasonality and your storms and your droughts and your small storms and your big storms have all got their own, sorry, I'm trying to just manipulate this at the moment. Right, sorry about that. Yeah, so what are we talking about today? So the Flow Partnership is all about understanding your water. So I've given this title here, Engineering with Nature. Okay, and that's borrowed from the Americans at the moment, who have the most money. They like to call it that, but about 10 years ago, somebody told me that what I was doing was something called natural flood management. Now, I've never really liked that term, but that was the business I was in. So we often refer to NFM as being the big issue in the UK. And in the last couple of years, you probably would have heard the term nature-based solutions. Okay, so natural flood management falls under nature-based solutions, but I would like to think that if there is to be nature-based solutions, we can actually define what that means and actually put something more solid behind it, because at the moment it's a bit of a big concept and it means different things to different people. So why engineering? Because as Minnie says, I'm a scientist. I've been a scientist all my life, but I realized that observing processes is not enough. So I was standing in Spain on some beautiful terraces that had been constructed by the farmers, and these terraces were eroding and the whole landscape was disappearing into what we call badlands, like a desert. So we were studying that, and there was one day when I could see the reason why one terrace was eroding. It was because there was a breach in the man-made ditch, and I could see that was flooding the terrace. And so I decided, went to the boss and said, we need to talk to the farmer and fix this, and then we'll observe what happens when we fix it. And he said, no, we're scientists, we're here to observe, and that's it. And I was outraged by that. So I very quickly sort of became an engineer. And the reason I become an engineer is because I think we should change the systems that we're studying. Okay, and that means talking to farmers, talking to local government, and trying to organise, make people understand what the problem is, and then quite often experimentally go into the landscape and start changing the landscape and try to understand it. So that's why I believe that engineering with nature is where we're at now. And lots of thanks to my colleagues at various places, James Hutton, Newcastle, Trinity College, Dublin, and all the people that have helped us. There's a couple of links there if you want to have a look at some other work there, but we'll push on. So I'm going to try and keep this as visual as possible without too many technical terms and science and things. And I might stop about halfway through so you can ask some questions about the first part, and then I'll go on to give you some more examples in a second part. So what are we talking about? So within a landscape, when it starts raining, everything happens. And it sets off a whole cascade of processes that we often feel helpless about. But when the water falls from the sky, you do have literally a few hours to do something with it before it disappears out of your system. Or maybe you're further down the system and the water suddenly appears, and then you might be able to do something with it and then pass it on. So we all have an opportunity to do something with our rain and our runoff. So most of our features are quite small and towards the top of the systems. We're not working on really big rivers here. So if a river is about 4 or 5 meters across, we probably wouldn't work on it. We'd be working upstream of that. So we're in fields, in farm ditches and drains, and in small channels. And here's just some examples of what we call runoff attenuation features. It's exactly what it says. Once water turns into runoff, whether it's on the surface, in the soil, or in the ditch, or in the river, then we can do something with it. And the basic principle is that we slow it down. And if you can slow down water, then you have a chance of reducing your floods, bringing down your pollution, and hopefully recharging the soils and the aquifers with more water so that there's less drought risk. But because we build features, so like they're on the wooded magic margin or on woody debris, we plant new trees and we allow more biodiversity. Now, in theory, this should also collect carbon. So if we change the system a little bit, it might have more impacts than we think. So multiple benefits is part of the story. But really what I'm going to try and show you is repeat. You're going to see feature after feature, and hopefully it'll build a picture in your head of how you can just tweak the system to store the water. And there's a few little design issues that come up. So please ask questions about how big things are and where they are and what they're made of. But first, let's get back to the problem. So we all need food and we all need water. So the picture on the left there at the top shows you what the United Kingdom looked like probably in about 1945. It was already a farmed landscape, but it was still fairly natural. The runoff flow pathways, the rivers, the soil were in still good state of health, and we were producing food. But I think the whole world now is pushed to the status where we don't want to have food insecurity. So we are now busy farming the whole of our world, which is a good thing because we need food and we need water. But it does have an adverse effect on the soil, on the channels, and what happens when it rains. So if we do have intensification, for good reason, we are starting to see more flooding, more pollution, more drought risk, less biodiversity, and some carbon loss. So we need to almost accept that is the fate of our landscape. So is there a way of getting all our food and all our water whilst reducing all those things? And that's what our goal in the Flow Partnership is to show that we can do that. But it involves a little bit of engineering and a little bit of thinking about the landscape, and certainly the river's edge, the riparian area, and the drains. So here we start with an example. So it's always worth going to the oldest map you can find. So this is a Scottish village where my colleagues work. And we've got a nice river there, nice braided channels, big wide, lots of gravel. And that's it in the past. So then we had something in the UK called the Great Farming Period in the 50s to about 1900. And everything was turned into farmland. And you can see that most landscapes have changed radically over time. So all those blue lines are for draining the land and control. There isn't even a river there really. And then if you come to today, you can see there's still blue lines, but these other blue lines are now underground. Okay, so draining the land was seen as taking on the wilderness and calming it down and making it work for us. So we need to realize that the world has changed and that it's got all these unexpected side effects. But we need the food, so we need to do it. The other thing is, when you go to school, they teach you about soils and they tell you about O horizons and A horizons and B horizons and give you this feeling for what soils are. Well, most farm soils are not like that. Once you farm a soil, you change it radically. And in fact, if you start farming soils, you have to go further. So in the UK, we have to drain our soils, otherwise the soil goes anoxic and you get no crop. So we tend to have a cultivated layer and a compacted layer, certainly in the UK, but together they give us what we call low infiltration. And in the science that we've done on this, we can see this clearly, that all the activity is now in the top layer. And the photographs on the right are to show you a field where you can see the water can't get in the ground. It's running off, forming these ponds. But at that site, on that day, we dug down into the soil and it was dry below 30 centimeters. So all the water, all the hydrology is occurring in the top layer. And even the low one here, you can see we get rivers of what we call overland flow on grassland. And grassland seen as being less trouble than arable, the crops, but they still cause a lot of problem. And it's because soil is just not capable of accepting the water. So we need to accept that the landscape's changed and the soil's changed. So the net result of this is on my only graphs, but if you were standing in the river and you were measuring the amount of water going past you, we believe that there's too much water, there's too much runoff coming down through the system that should be in the soil and should be slowly recharging into the rocks. So we need to target this peak. Now it's very important, this point, because we like to call this a surplus. So if you ever have a surplus amount of water, for example, in a monsoon or in your rainy season, then if you don't do anything about that, it will just run away and go to the sea or go to another country. Not doing any good there. So you need to realize that this water is causing problems and therefore we should need to do something about it. So unless we were to stop farming, plant loads of trees, which in itself can be dangerous, we need to manage this bit of water. So we think we can manage this in certain locations for a certain amount of time in the catchment. So we're going to try and restore our systems. So I'm going to give you an example now of where this all started back in just about 2008. There's a small village to the north of Newcastle, which is in the north of England. And this poor village was flooded 7 times in 7 years. So the poor people were very upset. It's only a small village. The catchment's only 6 kilometers square. You can actually see all the fields. But it starts off in the hills. It's very steep, comes onto some flat land, and then goes into the town. So it was proposed to build a pond here on the edge of town, a traditional engineered pond, £2 million, £2.5 million. And they said even that wouldn't protect the village from the kind of storms that we were having. So somebody said, would you try something else? So they asked us, based on some other work they've seen by us, whether or not we could do a more natural solution. And this is what they call natural flood management. So I'm going to show you an example of that as our first case study. So have a look at the pictures, and then if you keep some questions about how they're designed and worked, then we'll have a little break and chat about it. So first of all, we targeted the ditches. So this is actually in forest ditches. And these are not very nice. We wouldn't build them like this now. We'd use natural materials and make it much higher probably. But that was our first attempt. So we all have to practice. Remember, practice, practice, practice. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. And that just lets most of the water underneath. But when there's a really big storm, the water backs up and ideally would then spread onto into the forest. But then this is the fun one. So we found this beautiful location in a field, and I said, that's where we need to build our first feature. So this is, some people call this the whiskey barrel, but this was our first ever leaky dam. It's a dam that's designed to leak. So half the water that comes in has been diverted from the channel, and half the water that comes in comes across the land. So by building, it's about 1 meter high at its highest point, and it's made of wood, and the wood goes into the ground 1 meter, and it stores about 600 cubic meters of water. And you can see that it just temporarily holds the water. It leaks through. Most of the water leaks around the edge here and then works its way slowly back to the channel. And so we had an enormous storm which wiped out all the villages in the area, apart from Belford. Belford was the only place not to flood. And we built about 4 of these, and that was it. So that was this worth its weight in gold, this this photograph. And there's my friend who designed it and built it, Ian. And here it is dry, so it's still farmland. So the farmer there was very keen that he didn't lose any land. It's very marginal farming up here. But this is also an engineered structure. You can see it's double braced, and the cows are all busy scratching themselves on the barrier. And it does get a bit waterlogged here, but it is a barrier and does actually stop a lot of sediment. It gets waterlogged. But the farmer is happy, cows are happy, and very small impact on the farming business, but a big impact for the people of Belford. And here's another one. I put this one in because everybody goes, why is there a random fence in the middle of a field? But when it rains, 2 big rivers of overland flow come down here. Because again, even though this looks quite natural, the soil is degraded, and therefore it does produce lots of runoff. This is shortly after a storm. It will actually fill up and overtop, and it overtops around the edge, the furthest route back to the channel. So it just holds the water. And the idea is that when these are full, they can take away that peak that we were talking about. But then 12 hours later, the pond is gone and it's back to being a farm. And that's important. Further down the system, there's a little forest in here. So we put a series of leaky dams in, which we call large woody debris. So at first, the local agency, government agency, said, you can't chop down any trees. So we went for a walk and they said, oh, these are sycamore trees. We don't like them, so they allowed us to chop them all down. But we've planted new trees in their place, more indigenous species, oaks and alders and ash. But this looks very natural, and it's supposed to look natural. And in fact, a lot of people wouldn't notice it as being unnatural, but it is an engineered structure. You can see the logs are all holding each other in position, and they're attached to the bank. And so how this works is it backs up all the water, and the water goes onto the floodplain. So for these to work, you need a bit of floodplain really to make them work. And they're very cheap. And as we're moving down through the system, so over here we have another branch, very, very fast responding, can hit this area, cause trouble. So we built this structure. This is made out of soil and some material from an old quarry. You can see a big pipe in there. So we always have a big pipe in the dam. It's not meant to fill up, it's meant to leak, so that it can work during very big events. And that's in a wheat field for that year. And this is what happened during the storm. So you see the young crop is catching on. But the most important thing here is we built this dam as a road, almost like a bridge. So the farmer now can traverse backwards and forwards and get his cattle backwards and forwards each day. And we paid the farmer to build this. We had to come and fix it, but we paid the farmer to build it. And you can see this discolored water, and about a ton of sediment came out from this event. And then the farmer attempted to plow that sediment back in. And this is where you get the big crop, because this is where all the nutrient and fertilizer is. So that was a great solution, and everybody can see that it's got multiple benefits. And it also stops the animals making a real mess when there's when it's really wet. So it kind of ticks many boxes. A bit further down. So here, the farmer was in an environmental scheme called a buffer strip scheme, where they were asked not to build in the first 10 meters. So the ditches around the back. And this was what we call a buffer zone. So it was just abandoned land, a passive margin, whatever you want to call it. So we went in and we built a bund. So we scraped material from here, put it here. It's about, again, 1 meter high. We don't usually go beyond 1 meter high. There's a number of reasons for that. The engineering gets harder and there are some legal issues as well. So we always go, what we say, under the radar with these things so that nobody notices that they're there. And there you can see just sitting there, it's still a buffer zone, but when it rains, we take water off from the channel and it fills this feature up. And again, it's got a big pipe in it. We did lots of science on that one. And then is there one more? Yes, we won an award from the Institute of Civil Engineering, which is at the time was progress, that it was seen as being part of the solution. Okay, so you can ask me some questions about that in a minute. But just
yes.
Here's the only science bit for today. So Alex Nicholson, our good friend, he did his PhD here and he studied this pond forever. So he knows exactly what's happening. And he was able to build a model of this one pond. And this box here represents this pond. And one pond is not enough. So we built what we call a network model. So we could have, let's imagine if we had more ponds. So again, I'm going to have to show you another graph. So if you were standing in the channel just downstream of here, then this is the water coming through. Doesn't matter what the number is, but you can see we had some very, very big events whilst we were studying. We're very lucky to have flood events during a study. Sometimes you have to wait 100 years. And these lines here, so this line here, this is the observed flow. This line here is what happens if you have 5 ponds. And you can see it has no effect. In fact, 10 ponds have no effect. 15 ponds start to have some effect, but 20 ponds start to have an effect. And then 25, and then you can see that that peak that we were starting to target is being stored. At the moment, a lot of it in the model goes back into the channel, but we hope that if it stays there for 12 to 24 hours, a lot of the water will go into the ground. So we are trying to think about the whole of the landscape here. But to do it, we have to prove that each individual feature is working. This is another location where we built something for flooding, but we've always had an eye on water quality. And my original background was in managing pollution from farms. So we built 2 things. Up on the top right here, we have a nice big pond. The farmer wanted a pond. We wanted an empty pond so that it would work for flooding. But the farm said, oh no, I want a nice pond. And it's not, so we built it as a big ecological little island in the middle. And this has got an extra 1 meter again of storage. So it does store water. But we said, well, if you leave that there and it's all farmland upstream, it's just going to fill with sediment. So we now recommend that if you ever put a big pond in like this, that upstream you should build what we call a sediment trap. And this is a 3-tier sediment trap. Here's me standing in the top trap about there. This is after 1 year and you can see the sediment is already building up. And I recently returned to this site and these 2 are now absolutely full. And the farm was supposed to empty it, but they haven't. So let's come back to that. We'll discuss maintenance later on. Again, just a tiny bit of science. So with these 3 features, we were taking out half of the sediment. The suspended sediment was being removed and some phosphorus and some nitrate. So even though we weren't trying to remove nitrate, we were trying to get the sediment and the phosphorus, we were able to trap it. So I think that the best thing is to recover that material and put it back on the land as a fertilizer. So it does work. So again, this is evidence that we have benefits. Again, I'm just going through lots of examples here of different types of measures. Here we are in the up in the Pennines, place called land owned by the National Trust, and we built some features. You can see we've cut into the bank of the river, and we've put in this feature we call a swale. the little board behind my feet there, which is if the water level goes above that, then water leaves the river. You can also see this lovely color. So this is from peaty soils. So we often get this nice color of tea. And a storm has just been through, and we came up to check to see if everything's been washed away. So the idea here was, if this channel 5 or 10 times a year will discharge into this area. So this area we want to restore as a wetland, okay, for carbon purposes. And there's a little, you can't quite see, but there's something at the other end. This is the other end. So about 600 meters away, we've got a JCB HIMAC building another big bund. Okay. So there's also a sediment trap here to try and clean the flow before it went into this pond. And then it goes through. So here's the bund. You can see the bund is quite big. It's about 8 meters wide. So, but we had the space, so we were able to do it. And a lot of water comes through, again, a big pipe. So we put these stones here to stop erosion. Otherwise the water would shoot out and erode this bank. And it all seems to work very well, very well. We get thousands and thousands of cubic meters of storage there for about £10,000, which is good value for money. And it ticks all boxes. But the most important thing is probably this: when you find a location in the landscape that's perfect, then you can get a lot of work done in just a few locations in the landscape. So you've got to find them. You need to train your eye. Now, here's another one in the uplands on Halt Whistle Burn. Now, this is kite cam. So there's my poor little student who's about to, we have to tie her to the floor sometimes, otherwise we'll get dragged away in the wind. But if you can see, the channel flows down here. Again, there's very, very organic, rich soils, very, very fast response. And therefore we put in a chain of these ponds. So this here is the bund. Again, it's quite big. So we had a very good digger drive that was able to excavate this material and place it perfectly back here with the grass intact. And so this can store a very large amount of water compared to the size of the catchment. But immediately downstream of here, we have another feature. I don't know if you ever played the game Kaplunk, but it's a game where there's lots of straws with lots of marbles above it, and you pull them out and the marbles drop down. And it looks a bit like this. So you can see all these like logs laid out over 60 meters. And the reason why it's laid out like this is that we realized that building barriers here was probably not the best thing to do. Now, the reason why we were working on this area is that this whole area is eroding. All these trees you can see are slowly but surely falling into the ditch. And there's a big problem of big stones, the big stones you can see here, being carried down to the village and blocking the bridges and causing flooding. So the idea here is to slow the flow, which is one thing we always do, but to also trap the sediment and to stabilize these banks so that it stops eroding. So that's what we do. And it was very interesting. We assumed that this would start filling with stones, but ironically it didn't. It actually built a new bank of stones upstream, which then stabilized about 50 meters of bank further upstream. So again, we study these things once we've built them. And this is 10 tons of wood, all delivered by using a horse. We couldn't get a tractor in here or a digger. So Jimmy the horse delivered all this wood for us. And just to end this first part, we're working with the Environment Agency on a really big scheme, 100 square kilometers, which is, some bigger villages. And this is just one subcatchment, Killhope Burn at the top here. And you can just about see, this is a terrain map. So these are the high bits coming down into the valley. And you can see the features that we're planning on building and starting building. Just a couple of examples. Here's again, that wooden structure, and it's on precious moorland. These are our carbon peatlands. So they do generate a lot of runoff, but you can see we've managed to fit them into the landscape following the contours. The one below is more difficult to see. This is more down in the sheep and cattle area. This is the bund here. You can see the overflow structure here with the stones. And again, that stores a large amount of water. And most people wouldn't even know it was there. In fact, we have to use the stones to find it ourselves. So you do need a lot of these features in order to make a difference. Okay, now I thought we'd just take a, oh, and there's one more. So in the actual drainage network further downstream, we're building these big leaky dams again, big enough so that they hold some water and spill water onto the banks. So I was wondering, Minnie and John, would now be a good time for a couple of questions?
Yes, why not? There are already
another
actually a
section
couple of
to go.
questions.
Really just points of clarification, because that was a lot to take in. And then I'm going to give you some more now. Again, it will be a lot to take in.
So yes, it's a good time to pause halfway through. There are a couple of questions in the chat. There's one from Helen who's asking, why is planting lots of trees dangerous?
Oh, so have you got another hour? So one of the things that we have in the UK is that a lot of trees are being planted, but as nature-based solutions, we would say you need the right tree in the right place for the right reason. So if you were to cover some of those landscapes with trees, then you increase your drought risk. You will lose 30 to 40% of your annual runoff. Okay, so it becomes very vulnerable to changes in rainfall. So you can, again, because we're all interested in this water balance, you can take your water balance too far in the other direction. So we need the right, so it's difficult to say what percentage of trees, but if there was 10 to 20% of trees in the landscape, possibly in the riparian area where they would probably be most useful, you could still have a farmed landscape, have the right number of trees, and you wouldn't increase your drought risk. So if don't let anybody plant eucalyptus on your land, because that's just will take away all your water forever. You know, let's keep eucalyptus in Australia.
No, they're planting it. Uganda's being planted with eucalyptus like you can't imagine.
Well, you know what comes next.
And these are nature-based solutions.
Well,
so it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy.
You need to dig some soil pits to show that they're much drier. Eucalyptus will grow at 4 meters a year. The roots, they literally mine water. Somebody planted some in the UK, and I was nearly fell over. I was so shocked. Yeah, but if you put the right tree in the right location. So again, in Brazil, if you cut down your trees, the thing that will happen next is that you will have a drought. You know, we need the right number. Trees provide great functions, but you need the right trees in the right place. And so if you integrate them with things like runoff attenuation features and these wetlands and floodplains, then you get the kind of mixed benefits that you require. But every location is different. Let's say that. Okay, don't apply one rule from Australia to Uganda.
Yeah. So the one other question was what about costing? I mean, you showed us so many features. It's a bit difficult to answer. What is the total cost?
Compared to most options, this is virtually free. So if there was a flooding scheme, so the flooding scheme for Belford was £2 million, we literally spent 30 or 40,000 pounds. We took some money for ourselves as scientists, so we spent about 200,000 pounds rather than 2 million. And even the £2 million option was not going to save the town. That's the reason why they had to come to us, because they knew that spending £2 million, they would have been flooded anyway, and that would have been terrible PR. So costs can be kept down so long as you work with the local community who know where all the materials are. We often incentivize the farmers to build the structures so that they get some payment, so they can see a return. And then what we're doing now in the UK is trying to make sure that if there is any loss of land, so for instance, if it went from a field to trees, they get payment for the whole field. But that might not be the best thing for food production. It might not be the best thing for the water balance. So what we would say is build these small runoff attenuation features that have a small footprint, but can have a big impact. So small features, big effect. So we also need to pay farmers for a little bit of loss of land and for the fact that they're supplying services to the whole of the system downstream. They're still producing food. There's still lots of water, which hopefully will be cleaner. And there should be less flood and drought risk. But putting costs on that are impossible. And it has to happen everywhere in the landscape.
Great. Okay. Another question. What are the effects of the engineered buffers on aquatic vertebrates?
Right. So we have very, very strict rules. The reasons why we work upstream rather than big rivers is because we don't want to touch the stream. In fact, the kind of working rule we have is we never touch a channel. Okay. We never go into a channel. If we put something across, it won't touch the channel. But usually we want the water to come out of the channel. So we only have to work on the bank. So we very, very rarely affect any aquatic system. What happens as a side effect of our other features, depending on whether we build a wetland in our system, then we get benefits. We get new life. And even the temporary wetting and drying seems to give more biodiversity. If we ever put a sediment trap in, the next thing we'll get is newts. So the newts cause loads of trouble because we want to scrape the soil out, and the ecologists say, no, you can't scrape the soil out because it's got newts in it. So we wait until December and get a special license and remove sediment then. So there's always ways of solving things. But I would say that we're creating the riparian area, we're changing the ditches, we're changing the corners of fields and little bits of floodplain. And they all seem to have benefits for biodiversity. Or they should, you can design it in.
Great. So one more question here. What type? It's a sort of more technical one. What type of GIS models are you using? Can we also use the WEAP model for forecasting runoff, pollution, and storage?
If you go onto a UK website and type in opportunity mapping for NFM, or it's a standard GIS tool. So if you're using ArcGIS and you use the hydrology tools, you can find out where the flow path. I'm going to show some diagrams that include a few of these in a minute. And they tell you where the runoff pathways are, and they give you the obvious locations in the landscape where to put these things. There's a lot of debate about what feature it should be and how big it should be. That's the big debate. But it's actually relatively easy if you're on the landscape, i.e. in the fields. You have to know where your ditches are. So modifying your ditches is often one of your best opportunities. So you don't have to have a GIS map. You just need to know where your ditch is. So ask the farmer, where's your ditch? So there's a lot of people trying to put a lot more science and technology onto this thing than is really needed. You need to go to the land. You need to walk. That's the reason why, as a community, we need to learn more in the water school, is that there is ways of understanding your landscape and work together to actually say, well, actually, I'm not going to produce food here anymore. I'm going to put a wetland in because it gives me all these other benefits. Or I might plant some trees here for some benefits. So even though the one I would recommend is, I'll put it in the chat afterwards, the River Restoration Centre. The River Restoration Centre has probably the best tool. I think the Rivers Trusts also have a tool. You just get a terrain map, press the button, and it will give you all the opportune areas.
Great, thanks. That's all the questions.
Be careful.
No,
right,
there is one more question. Sorry,
okay.
There is one more question. How often do you desilt the trap?
Oh, yes.
Oh, right. One of the debates we'll have to have afterwards is maintenance. Okay. So some of our features have been in nearly 20 years now, so we might need to replace them. But the maintenance, so most of the time, farmers will not do the maintenance. So if the asset is a flood defense asset, then the government will do it. The Environment Agency will come along and manage the asset, because it's for flood protection. They'll take the wood away and they'll dig out the sediment. But what we really need is a system where we pay farmers to maintain the sediment. So we put a feature in. So sometimes you find that people put wetlands in, and then the wetland gets full of sediment, and then it becomes a problem. It can actually become a pollution source, or might get washed away. So you actually need to design sediment traps further upstream to protect your ecological features or your recharge features. And we need to pay farmers make it very easy to get in and to remove the sediment and to put it back on the land. And this is the bit we're struggling with. So we need a much more understanding that that is your topsoil, that is your organic material. It's yours. Put it back on your land. Don't lose it. Yeah, so we need to get that bit sorted. I would say once a year. Why would I say once a year? Because you will probably have 2 or 3 big storms or a rainy season once a year. So you probably need to go back and manage your system then. Sometimes it's really obvious. You have 1 storm, all your traps are full. Okay, and if you don't remove them, then they may still have some benefits, but they won't store as much water. Once a year, it's a working number.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. And then another one jumped in. How do SOMs function in sinking water, and what is the effect of draining them?
We have a really strange debate on this one. So with a lot of farmers, they will take us to their landscape where it's waterlogged and say, I can't get a crop from this. And sometimes it can be waterlogged. So we often put in land drains for the farmers as part of the deal. I showed you an example where we built a bridge, or we pay farmers to put fencing or hedges or something. But one of the things we often do is we put land drains into our features in order that they will dry out quicker. Yeah, but we're still using this number of 12 to 24 hours of water being there, but you don't want it to be there all year. You want it to disappear. So if you want to improve the whole landscape, you can think about maybe improving the quality of the farming in some areas, but still having this temporary storage. And in those temporary storage zones, that's when the water can get down into the soil. And as in Rajasthan, which you've probably seen from Mini, they actually located perfect locations where if you put water over the rock, it will go into the rock. Yeah, so we would often look for gravel areas or places where we know infiltration is high to build these features. But if not, we will put a land drain in order to manage the land for farming purposes. So we want farmers to make money, but we want the catchment to be safe.
Great, thanks. I think that's probably it for now.
Yeah.
So I think best if you could go to the second part. And
Yeah.
then we can
So again, more pictures just to stimulate your brain. So here's some examples. Is that okay? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So this is a catch, the work we're doing in Ireland, primarily for water quality, but they did say, could we address flooding? So we again, another term, it's not called natural flood management anymore. It's now called natural water retention measures, which is the official European term for runoff attenuation features. So I'll just show you a couple of examples. So here's one site where we have a farm and there's a ditch running through the farm, and there's quite an intense farm here. So the first thing we've done here is spilled water from the ditch, which is usually full of sediment when it's raining, into the forest. So it just runs through the forest and then comes back in again. And that's trapping so much sediment. It's amazing. We probably will have to remove sediment. And then you can see that the ditch comes down here, and it used to just go down through here. So the farming itself often diverts water where it thinks is best for farming reasons. But this means it was a perfect opportunity to let water out. So the water flows across this field and comes into this enormous pond that we built here, which we call a field runoff attenuation feature. And then these are all leaky dams. Okay, so you can see that there's multiple interventions there across the farm. Let me just show you what they're. So this is what the leaky dams look like. But I just want to say that these probably don't work that well because the channel is too deep and the features are too small compared. So you can't spill water onto the floodplain. But these work really well for low flows. So they do trash up with material, and we're hoping there is a bit of sediment building up here, but we think that water is going into the ground and the base flow is starting to change slightly. So maybe that's more of a low flow feature. And this is just a photograph of the pond when it's full. So the water comes in, it's got an overflow structure, but then this pipe here drains the water again in about 24 hours. And you can see the animals are a bit of an issue. They do sometimes come in and just stand in the water and make a bit of a mess. but we are worried that they might be remobilizing sediment. So if I was here, again, I would probably put a new sediment trap upstream here. But you can see how they fit into the landscape, and we're still feeling our way in. And this is the structure, quite an engineered structure, probably more engineered than we needed to be. But once the water gets up to about 50 centimeters, then water comes into the field. Again, trying to get those levels right is quite difficult. So we often say, observe 5 or 10 storms, and then you'll be able to set the level correctly for the rest of the time. So here, this is County Wexford in the southeast of Ireland, and we've got a landscape here, a very intensive landscape again. At least all the hedgerows are still here, which is nice. And then there's quite an active little stream running down here. So we've looked at this little floodplain here and thought, well, if we could take water from this location and run it across the floodplain, then it will all slow down, hopefully infiltrate, and be cleaner. We get all the way down to here. So there's a bund here. So this area are all ponds, and then overflows back into the ditch. So in order to stop the water disappearing, we've had to build a bund all the way along here. And this white thing here is a brand new bridge. So the deal for the farmer is that we build them a new bridge. So as part of the works, there's a new bridge. The bridge is elevated, which means that the water goes round the bridge and into the pond. So everybody wins. Just a bit of engineering here. So at the top end, the water comes out, it flows along the bund, keeps going, and eventually ends up in our pond. Down the bottom here with, again, scraped material. And again, probably 10,000 euros tops, I think, for this. We did have a problem. This pipe was put in. It was a bit weak here. He dug it out, put the pipe in and put the material back. So this wasn't my engineer. And so this bit got eroded. So now we've had to fix it and we put a new structure in. We've not put a pipe in this time. We've just put we've just put in like a little gap, an overflow. So again, just to get your eyes into that, we can draw water off, move it across the little floodplains, and then a little feature at the end gives you lots and lots of benefits. So this is one of these tools, the GIS tools that people talk about. So if you have, so we have 1 meter resolution maps, you might not have that, but you can sort of see the lie of the land. And if you run these algorithms, it shows you where the water would flow. And it's pretty obvious that it all ends up down in this ditch. It goes off this system. But what people do now is they look and say, well, maybe the edge of fields or the corner of fields are the best places for these features. So we can start to add up the total amount and we can start to quantify some of this. So I'm just going to show you this feature here because we're just about to build some of these features. There's already some features in here, I'll show you. But we're going to build a nice big feature here. We've also got these magic margins, which are areas of uncultivated field where we try and also slow and clean the flow. And we often recommend these areas for tree planting. So let's have a little look. So this is still at the sketch phase, but this will be getting built this year. So we have a track. We have an old wall, so we don't want to touch the wall at the moment. So we're putting a new bund, again, 1 meter high, into the terrain. So it's pretty obvious where you put these in the terrain. You can actually see the lie of the land. So there's a level at the top, and this will create a very big pond. Again, temporary. There's a subsurface drain. If this subsurface drain doesn't work, we'll fix it and make sure it works. So again, 12 to 24 hours of ponding. It will spill. So we're going to build a cross structure across the track. So this is probably going to be like a French drain or a grid, an iron grid. And then the water comes into the margin. Again, it's just a part of the field that's not cultivated. And we just make life really hard for the water to go through. And then eventually it might overtop into here or will re-enter the ditch further on. So that's going to get built this year. And that's more for water quality and quantity. Now, we've got quite an upland system. Now this is a very interesting site because this is turning into 100% forest over the next 20 years. They're busy planting all the trees now, and they're interested to study what the impact is. But we said to them, can we look at your landscape? So it would take 10 to 20 years to get benefits from the trees in terms of flooding. We're not sure if it's a drought risk here because it rains a lot in Scotland, but small shifts in climate might give some drought risk. So we said, well, we found these little locations in the landscape, which we call pocket floodplains, these meandering zones. And here's another one below. And we are going to build our features on there. So you get your benefits immediately. So again, you have to forgive my sketches. So the river comes down, we put a barrier in, we spill the flow onto the floodplain, we push the flow as far as we can onto the floodplain, divert it in and around, and just make life really hard for the flow. Now, this is really well drained soil, so we would expect the water to disappear on its own quite quickly. So again, it's an experiment to see whether we can actually change the water balance just using these small areas. And then another one in Ireland, Northern Ireland this time, where we're more interested in the pollution coming from the farming. So they did this experiment where they've built willow. Again, willow grows really fast. It's fantastic stuff. And they've done some other experiments, but this section here is lots of willow. And they've got good evidence that it does reduce the pollution. But we've said you've not optimized or maximized your options here. So we've suggested that they build these. So along the ditch, most of the water just disappears straight past the willow, and only the water that comes in from the hill slope that goes through the willow will be clean. So we're saying you're not using your landscape to its maximum. So again, if you did have an area where you're planting some trees, we would say divert your surplus flow through there. Again, it slows. Again, it hopefully will recharge the aquifers, but it will definitely clean the soil. Clean the flow. So that again, hopefully will get built next year. And then this was it. So we put this diagram together for our holding water in the landscape that we produced about 10 years ago now with Vinny. So if you put them all together, you can actually probably, this is an important point to make, you can probably manage your flow before you get to the big rivers. Yeah, so look at where the dirt is on the farm, look at how water moves through the fields and in the ditches, do some work there. Look at your buffer zone, see if you can modify them. And then as you go down through the landscape, as it becomes more natural, i.e. wiggles, you might be able to plant some trees and create some nice diversions. So if you put them all together, then that's how we would see the landscape standing a chance. So the only bit of science, we think that if there was to be a sacrifice of 5% of the land, you could probably get your biodiversity and your flood reduction, your drought reduction. But we also need, maybe, this is a very uncertain number, 5% of your land to be inundated for 12 to 24 hours. So you can still get a crop from the land or animals, but you do need to allow for temporary storage. So that's our thinking. Now, if we do look at scaling up, what else have we done? Well, we've worked on some bigger floodplains now. This is with Arup, Alex Nicholson at Arup, where we designed, so we've excavated quite a lot of material and used it to build banks. The channel runs down here. And we've created a whole series of ecological zones and planted nice flowers and things. But it's primarily for flood storage. This is what it looks like when it's full of water. We've had a few big events. But the idea is that water disappears quickly. This is a bit over-engineered for my liking. I would have liked it to have been more natural, but this real engineers were on this, not kind of amateur engineers like myself. This is the exit of one pond, and this is the start of another pond. The only reason I really wanted to show you this was the bridge. This is really important to the local community, this area, for walking dogs. Now, I've worked there for a long time. It gets very muddy, and you do slip around, and you see people and their dogs falling over. So we've put in a new route for them to walk. So it's really important, and these bridges are seen as quite quite pretty, and everybody seems, well, at the moment they seem happy. And then further upstream from there, in a forest, we were working with the Tees Rivers Trust, and they said they wanted to put some leaky dams in. I said, well, this is quite a big channel for us, so you'll have to put some big features in. And they took me seriously and built these enormous features. So they literally took down local trees and knocked them over. The most important thing, this tree is alive. It's still growing. We call it spieling, where we bring half the tree down into the channel. And here's another one with the water backing up. And the whole idea here was just back water up and push it onto the floodplain. And the reason why this particular town of Stockton was flooding is that they'd over deepened this channel many years ago. So no water went onto the floodplain. So just re-engaging a channel with a floodplain can make a lot of difference. And then just a shout out to Mike Norbury, who's the greatest natural flood manager I know. He's the guy who just builds and builds and builds. And he invented the living barrier, really. And here is that location with a whole series of barriers in that are all alive. And these are working very well and store lots of water. And we can clearly see a change in the groundwater in this area due to these features. So again, we're getting the evidence together that it can work for floods, helps for droughts, and fits into the landscape, really. So this is now carbon accumulating as well, I think. So I'm just going to finish on one more ambitious scheme in a place called Kentmere in the Lake District, if anybody's been there. So if anybody's been to the Lake District, you know it's like big hills, long U-shaped glacial valleys, and full of lakes. It's a great place for lakes. So in terms of nature-based solutions, we said, well, if it's the Lake District, let's put some lakes in. So this is about 1.5 kilometers, and we think we could easily get very large amounts of storage in it. And this is where we are with the flooding issue. If we're going to address flooding, then you need really large amounts of storage. So a lot of people are saying, well, I'm not sure if we agree with you there. So this is where we're at, but at least we're showing that in these locations, there are potential. That's 80,000 cubic meters of storage for about £200,000. The EA want to put a barrier here, which will cost £10 million, but it will flood a very large area, probably 4 times that amount. And in order to work in the landscape, this landscape is a World Heritage Site, so you can't just turn up with a digger. So we decided that the best thing to do was to locate all these old dry stone walls and modify them into dams. So we were about to do this, but we haven't been able to do it yet. But again, a lot of these old walls have collapsed, so we would fix all the walls. So the World Heritage Site people, the Lake District National Park, appreciate what we're trying to do. And we would make it kind of impermeable. So we would make it impermeable here, put extra support in. So, and then they put a new gate in to let water through. And we think we can make that work. But again, I think there's a lot of, this is where we are, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not that will ever go ahead because flooding. And so the final thing is some photographs were taken after Storm Desmond had been through, which caused lots of trouble in Kendall further downstream. And you can see it's already flooding. And so they're saying, well, it's already flooding, so you can't flood it. But when I look at this landscape, I only see the green bits that are not flooding. And also the depth here is probably 10 or 20 centimeters, whereas we could easily have a meter. So I would say nature-based solutions, to use that term again, would be to mimic this process, but to make it work for the whole of the landscape. So nature-based solutions in imitating existing process, but maximizing the impact on floods and pollution, but minimizing impacts or even improving on farming. I think that is my last slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Leave you with the cows.
I mean, pardon?
I'll leave you with the cows.
What's really comes out to me every time I see this kind of work that you've been showing in the UK and Ireland and Scotland, and then we hear from farmers in Africa and in India, is it is all about holding water at the right spot in the landscape so that you can you can manage that water to either alleviate floods or to alleviate droughts. So essentially what you're suggesting can be used with the right balance in mind, even in landscapes that are moving towards drought as well. I think we can open this discussion out now to anybody who really wants to ask questions of Paul. As you can see, his experience in actually doing the work in the landscape is vast. And in my experience of Paul's work is that there is very little about water movement in the landscape that he doesn't know, and he has the science to back it. So it's experience and science together. So we have this wonderful opportunity here to pick Paul's brain for what we can do in Africa based maybe or what we are already doing. And if we have any questions around that, here's Paul. So would anybody like to ask questions? And John, you were about to say something.
No, I wasn't really, but I was just also saying, I think questions, but also jump in with some sort of thoughts, what it makes you think about. It's a very different context to ours, but I think there's a lot of kind of parallels, particularly in terms of the sort of principles of work that are coming through. I found it fascinating, I must say. So feel free to comment and give any reflections in terms of what it raises for you, or maybe it raises some questions. Questions are always useful. So either
feel free to put up your hand and ask a question. It doesn't have to come through chat.
Yeah, it doesn't have to come through chat. Exactly. It's just what I was going to say.
Mm-hmm.
Comments, questions?
There is one question here from Vanessa. Sorry, Colin. You go ahead and then we can ask that question in the chat. Yes, Colin.
Yeah, thanks. Fascinating presentation. I'm Colin from Namibia. We have rainfall ranging from virtually 0 to about 400 millimeters, 500 millimeters. So we're very dry and have flash floods and such. Mm-hmm. The models that were, or the GIS tools that would calculate where to do your interventions, they're clearly just applicable to the UK and that environment, or can you use a similar tool for our areas here? We don't really have perennial rivers. We have these flash floods and then it's all gone.
Yeah. So there's two things I would do there. One, these tools, you probably don't need them. They're quite useful just as one step at the start to say, this is the lie of the land. Sometimes the land can be quite subtle, so you don't see the pathway because sometimes you can't see the gradient. So sometimes if you have, but then it puts the onus on you getting some good terrain maps, which we can now get reasonable terrain maps across the world. And it gives you an indication of where you might put your features. Now, I think a lot of these features are not really following our line of saying you need a little bit of knowledge and inspiration to go out onto the land, walk the land, and start to see where you might start doing some interventions, where you might start building a few trial features to build up your own confidence, and then look around. So I look around Africa and I see some great designs and I think, oh, I like that one, I'll have a bit of that. You know, I mean, we can all share our experience. I still feel like I'm learning. So I think you can use a tool and you can get consultants in to give you a map, but I'm not sure if that's the way to go. You can try and do it yourself. It's not difficult to use the River Restoration Centre tools to give you an indication. But if you walk the land, you will see the small features that you'll see in your landscape. You'll see eroding features that tell you where the water's going. And then you'll see your drainage network, which again, you know where the water will be. And then it'll get to your small channels and it gets to your big channels. So in those smaller channels, the farm ditches and the fields themselves, you need to put some effort into thinking, how can I solve this problem using these simple design features of slow store filter? and then start to think, well, what shall I put in? So you might decide not to cultivate the places that are eroding, just let it return to grass. You might decide to widen your ditches. Okay, instead of sort of just maybe wide. So a lot of ditches we work with now, we often take them from being 1 meter wide to being 6 meters wide, just to make the water flow slowly across that system. And then if you have issues with sediment, maybe other pollutants, then maybe some sediment traps and wetlands. So you need to build up your confidence. You just need to know that it can be done. That's the only reason why we've got the UK examples and Rajasthan examples, is to just say, think about it and have a go. Become your own water managers. You're good land managers, become water managers. Just a word of warning that make sure it is a surplus amount of water you're storing. Don't take somebody else's water that need it downstream. So you need to make a whole, what we call a catchment plan. But you know the days when there's lots of water around, don't you? If you can get that water to just stick around for a bit longer, then, and the other thing we've realized is the reason why Belford didn't flood is not because we're brilliant. It's because the rain water that falls so fast is the easiest to slow down. So you just put some barriers in the way, like a traffic jam, then you can really slow down water quite quickly. One of the reasons why places flood is because of the wave gets going. Once the wave is going, it hits you and floods you. So you need to stop the wave starting in the first place.
Yep, I think that for me is a very powerful message coming through, is that we can all do it. And if I think of good examples around Southern Africa, which is where I know better, it's people who plunged in and started to do it and become brilliant water managers on their landscapes. But they started kind of thinking that perhaps they couldn't, perhaps overpower. This is something that experts have to come in and do. But it's as long as you follow those simple principles of like starting higher up and sinking, spreading, sinking, and so on. Thanks for that. Any more comments, questions, reflections? I hope that's answered you well enough, Colin.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Happy with that.
So we can go to Vanessa's question then. It's a UK specific question. Do water companies get involved with this work at all? And how much is the Environment Agency involved?
Yeah, I work every day with the Environment Agency, and they've been my best partner and my worst partner. The Environment Agency has many different parts to it. So some parts of the organisation are encouraging. Fortunately, a lot of my ex-PhD students are now in that section of the EA. But other groups like the traditional flood risk management managers, traditional engineers, they're very much against what we're doing and think we're causing them problems. So yeah, we work every day with the EA. Water companies, less so, apart from the fact that water companies are very big landowners. So they often own or work in partnership with landowners and the tops of the systems where we have our carbon landscapes, peat. And they often are quite draconian in their saying, remove all the sheep, remove all the farmers. They've been a bit like that in order to protect their water supply, because they have issues with discoloration of water and erosion. So they're trying to sort out their problems. So yes, there's a huge initiative. There's such a huge group of people in the UK. The people who are really helping are the Rivers Trusts. So again, a bit amateur, but they get skillful quite quick, and now they're quite powerful. They work with communities. And the River Restoration Centre, they're another good group. So the more people, the more eyes we have on the problem, the more collaboration we do, the better the catchment plans. And so I am hopeful that the catchment plans will be going. I'm just worried that we won't get enough funding, because most of the funding is in the flooding section. If we could only get 10 to 20% of the flooding budget, we could solve so many problems.
Thank you.
Any other reflections or experiences that you've had similar, where you've give examples of putting in lots of small features and starting to just hold and sink the water. We've got quite a lot, I think quite a few people here from Rescope and that work with schools. I don't know if you want to share any experiences you've had with schools holding water.
We've found in our urban areas where we do something called sustainable drainage systems, the schools often go first for becoming green, having green roofs and having ponds and wetlands on their land.
Yeah, there's a program here that called Rescope, and it's in about 5 countries, and they're working a lot with schools. But it's not schools in isolation; it's with schools and the community surrounding them.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's asked about slides. So this recording will be available on the Water School website. So anybody who wants to, look at the
I can make a PDF as well.
Yeah, we'll put it up on the Water School site, the PDF and the recording. So anybody who wants to refer back or look at the slides again, look at them in detail, and see what is possible from there for your own landscape, the material will be available.
Yeah, saw the question flashing past there about leaky dams and durability. Well, a lot of the materials we used initially have a guaranteed lifespan of 20 years, although we have started to see some of them crumble. I think the idea of the living barrier is the way forward. So if you can create leaky barriers, either using the trees that we spile down into the channel, or you surround it with willow, so the willow replaces the material. It does need maintenance because you need to sometimes weave your willow into a barrier, but the idea that you don't maintain these things would be the danger. So I would like to think that if you're the landowner or you're coordinating with landowners, you get best practice sorted out soon enough. So if you have an issue with sediment traps, build separate sediment traps. If you've got a ditch, you can widen the ditch and turn it into a sediment trap. And then you can recover your sediment, recover your nutrients. Okay. If you've got some leaky barriers, you've got to watch them because they will change over time. Sometimes they'll get better, sometimes they will get worse, sometimes it will just clog up. And therefore you need to think about maintaining them. So if you have lots of features, that's the safest way. And then just slowly but surely, we should be managing and maintaining our features. And the big gap in our knowledge, a big gap in our working is that this needs to be paid for. We need to keep up to say, look, if we manage our land correctly for you and produce food and give you cleaner water for longer, you need to pay for it. And so we need to keep the argument going that the whole of the landscape needs to function better. It'll make it safer in terms of floods and droughts, but it will be safer for climate change. Now, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but if we can get the landscape to function better, we might actually be able to ameliorate some of the effects of climate change and maybe even reverse some. But that's a long-term nature-based solution.
Yeah, I think it's not might. I think it will certainly ameliorate. So, in our context here, it'll make a huge difference in terms of resilience to climate change. Colin has got a question. Yeah, Colin, go ahead. Colin, you're on mute. Go ahead.
There we go. Is that better?
Yeah, can hear you.
One of our farmers, Jorg, is, I think, on the call as well. His farm is 20,000 hectares, extensive livestock at very low stocking rates because of the low rainfall. And his main resource there is rocks, because he's in kind of in the mountainous areas. Any suggestions in terms of dealing with issues of that kind of scale and with rock rather than wood?
Yeah, we use rock a lot. So for instance, in the Lake District, the gravel beds are very good for producing materials for construction. Now you have two ways of constructing. You could take kind of the Rajasthan approach where they actually built some very formal engineered structures, but you can build more informal, if there is such a thing, where you pile your stones strategically so that they actually make strong barriers, and they then act as filters. Now, we've built quite a few of these with stones, and everybody said that'll never hold water because it's too leaky, but they always hold water because there's always more rain than you think. And when it comes down, it sounds like in your landscape, you only get a few hours worth of really big storms. You need to keep that water back. And if you can maybe make it slightly more impermeable, then maybe you'll pond water and maybe it will go into the rocks and maybe we'll see it again. But if you want to just keep some water around for some time, it always seems to make some difference. If you've got really big droughts, there might be some times when you need to just accept that it's going to be dry. But if it was just less frequent and less troublesome, then I think that holding more water in the catchment is always a good idea, especially when it's really raining. Don't store the small storms, let them through, because they belong to everybody. But the big storms, we're talking thunderstorms, monsoons, greater than average storms, they're the ones you've got to hold some of it back, because we're artificially losing it. So you can't have a farm without degrading your soil. That's almost like accepted. So you can do all your regenerative farming and try and get your soil back to good condition. I'd always recommend that, but it's not always the case. And even if you get some of your capacity back in your soil, along comes a bigger storm and you still have the original issue. So if you can do regenerative farming and runoff attenuation features, I think you're in your best position. And stones are fantastic. But again, go build a couple. Go halfway down one of your ditches and put 5 tons of stone in, and then just observe it. Then make it bigger or smaller.
Yep, no, that's coming through strong. Just go out there and try different practices. Zachary, we'll be closing at 12:30 sharp, but Zachary, go ahead.
Okay, mine is just to say that I appreciated the presentation. Secondly, I have realized, I've seen that they have been using traps to trap silt. I think that's a good feature because it also increases the lifespan of the holes that you are digging on the ground, because the hole that you want to use is not silted very quickly because there's a trap which prevents now the silt from going to the actual, what we are calling water pans. The other thing I've noticed is that you are also planting grass along the water barriers, which I think also reduces erosion of the walls, so that the breaching is not obvious. And I think for me, it's something that I've learned. You can also plant grass along the water barriers so that you also reduce the erosion of the soil. Because the problem we have here in Africa is there's a lot of erosion, and when it rains, you find a lot of the soil becomes brown, and we know that color brown is actually we are losing a lot of soil to the water. But I think I have seen some ways we can also improve our situation here. Otherwise, thank you very much for the good presentation. Yeah. Thank you.
So if you have an issue with erosion, then you can have erosion features to stop erosion when you need them in every field almost. Okay, and then you can have a dedicated sediment trap further down the system, and then you do have an option to take discolored water and put it back onto the field. This is the one that people forget the most. They just think that flooding is a natural thing or it's come from the take water from your dirty channels and put it into the floodplains. You may need a sediment trap there, but two things will happen. You'll clean the flow and you'll have bumper crops in that location. You'll have really big crops. The other thing with putting grass onto the system, sometimes we have to seed the grass ourselves, but usually it grows back. So there are some designs. If you keep it, when you're building and you scrape your material, put your topsoil to one side and put your lower soil to another side. So you build most of the structure from low quality soil, but then you put your topsoil back on to the feature. Now, one of the ironies is that it means that the animals use it for grazing. We don't mind animals walking along the tops of these things if they're built properly. And so there's no loss of farmland. So the government arguing we don't need to pay you anything.
Great. So I think we'll bring it to an end now. So thank you so much, Paul. I think really interesting. And yeah, that's what the Water School Africa is about, is to try and, there's a lot of good work, some of the things you're talking about. There are people on this call who are working with communities, really starting to do this work on quite a significant scale. And we just really want to add momentum to exactly this kind of work, where it's lots of different features, it's people, it's communities doing it themselves, not waiting for experts, getting away from this idea of building big dams that just silt up anyway and cost a fortune, which some of us experienced a lot. So thank you so much for that. And just to let everybody else know, the first Tuesday of every month, we'll be having a presentation and discussion like this for an hour and a half. The next one will be on the 4th of April, and it'll be hosted by Groundswell in West Africa. So they'll be sharing some experiences in West Africa that farmers, communities have been using to hold water in their landscape, and how that's working, and what their plans for the future and so on. So do join us again on the first Tuesday in April, which will be the, if I got it right, I think it's the 4th of April, to hear of experiences from few countries in West Africa. So I don't know if you've got anything else to say, Minnie, before we close.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's the 4th of April, and Groundswell will be presenting, and you'll see that in a way we call this Water School Africa. And of course, we have a primarily large African audience, but with having Paul here and various others from different parts of the world, I mean, it's almost like a water school across the world. We learn from each other. We learn from what's working in one region. And as Paul said, you take a little bit, you see what others are doing and say, oh, I'll have a little bit of that. So this is really, the sessions are meant for this, to kickstart the thinking, to plunge right in with your communities, to manage the water that falls on your landscape and do it effectively, and learning from the experience of people like Paul. Paul, thank you very, very much. We're really appreciative you took out your time and shared your experience and your wisdom and your knowledge with our communities here who have joined us for this call. So go well, everyone. And we'll see you next Tuesday. Sorry, I beg your pardon, on the first Tuesday on the 4th of April for the next session of the Water School Africa. Bye for now.